Okay, thank you. Now, before I really get into this, I'd like to point out that this is what I'm going to present today is joint work with Niki Richt and Andreas Baumann at the University of Vienna. So a lot of what I'm presenting is was developed together with them. Right. Now, just to give you an idea of what I'm going to do in this talk, the main question that I'd like to address is what drives subjectification in semantic change, and the main agenda or the main aims of the talk are to challenge or, in fact, more or less supplement traditional accounts of subjectification. And if we aim to provide an explanatorily deep and more realistic account which is based in evolutionary pragmatics, as the title already said. And what we'll focus on is the role of listeners in this, but also more generally a kind of mutual process of mind reading or second guessing that happens in communication. We take a more qualitative approach to that, in that we used dictionary data and more qualitative corpus data, although we all did some quantitative work on it. But most importantly, we use evolutionary game theory to test some hypotheses that we come up with. And in fact, I'll have to skip over the first part here because if it's just going to be too much, but I'm happy to talk about that as well. Now, just to start out with what kind of the most basic assumption that we use as a starting point is that linguistic signals always represent or reflect either brute or social facts which are constructed as objective, so elements of external reality, or facts constructed as more subjective, so facts about the intentional states of a subject, intentions, beliefs, attitudes, goals, desires, and so on and so forth. Now, what happens in linguistic diachrony so in the history of languages is usually that more objective interpretations are replaced by subjective interpretation. So more subjective interpretations become pragmatically inferred and are eventually semanticized or conventionalized, and that's usually referred to as subjectification. I've given you one of the countless definitions of subjectification here, namely a very well-known one by Traugott. And she states that, in my view, subjectification is the mechanism by which meanings are recruited by the speaker to encode and regulate attitudes and beliefs. One example of such a subjectification process is the development of the word villain. Now, villain originally just meant a peasant or a resident of a village, so arguably referred to a more objective fact about the person, namely the origin or location. Nowadays, villain, as you will all know, means something like rascal, and we'd assume or we'd interpret that as a more subjective meaning, as incorporating some sort of evaluation or judgment on a person. One of the most prominent examples is modals. You're probably all aware of that. So one prime case of subjectification in language change that's often drawn on or always drawn on is the development from more deontic meanings to more epistemic meanings. John must work hard to survive expresses a more objective necessity, or you must leave now as an objective or a more objective command. If we say something like John looks tired, he must be working hard, that expresses not an objective fact, but more the speaker's subjective certainty or an attitude, a belief of the speaker about this person. Good. Now, subjectification has become something of a hot topic in the last decades. Most of the literature that there is focuses on, first of all, well, how do we define subjectification? How do we identify instances of subjectification? How do we operationalize all of this? What's the connection between subjectification and grammaticalization? And most recently, what's the relationship between subjectification and something that's called intersubjectification? And one additional point that's also received quite some attention is whether this is unidirectional. And we here start out from the assumption that even if there are some potential counterexamples, there is a really strong tendency in one direction. So there is a really strong tendency for subjectifications, while desubjectifications or objectifications are quite rare. Now, unfortunately, this issue hasn't received that much typological attention, so we can't be absolutely sure that this is actually something that happens or that's true, holds true for languages outside Indo-European languages. But our starting point, as I said today, is that this is really a strong tendency, even if it might not be absolute. There is this almost unidirectional tendency. And we want to know why that should be the case. Right, now, the established account, or the explanation established accounts give is that while meanings are recruited by the speaker to encode attitudes and beliefs, or in natural languages, in their structure and their normal manner of operation, provide for the locutionary agent's expression of their self and their own attitudes and beliefs. So the implied explanation in these accounts is humans have a need for self-expression, language change is primarily driven by speaker needs, subjective meanings serve self-expression better than objective meanings, so we can conclude that in semantic change, speaker needs should select for subjective meanings. So it's all about speaker needs and the speaker need for self-expression. Now, we see a few problematic issues with that, namely, first, the argument is slightly circular in that the need for self-expression is taken to explain subjectification, but at the same time, subjectification is taken as evidence of precisely that need. So the argument as such has a touch of, is slightly circular, as I said. The second problem we see is that there is something of an inherent contradiction in this whole argument, in that conventionalized subjectivity is a bit of an oxymoron. So speaker-specific communicative needs are extremely variable, maybe too variable to actually be conventionalized. So it's not entirely clear how that should actually work. If speaker needs are so variable, so dependent on specific contexts, situations, and so on and so forth, then how should we ever get to a situation where we could conventionalize this, or where this could be conventionalized? And additionally, so subjectification actually constitutes a sort of re-objectification. So as soon as something is conventionalized or semanticized, it's actually in a way objectified again. Good. The last 2 points, or the next 2 points, are what I'm going to focus on most in this talk. So first, or third actually, we think that all of these accounts are pretty speaker-centric. So listeners don't really play any role of their own. Traugott, for example, actually states that hearers explicitly states that hearers shouldn't play any role, so a hero perception model explains little or nothing about why subjectification should occur. But even if speakers are taken into account, listeners are taken into account, as in intersubjectification, then the listeners really only do what speakers want them to do and respond to their needs. So there's a lot of cooperation and a lot of mutual altruism involved here. And we think that this might be a bit too optimistic about human nature, even if you could argue against that, of course. So we think that traditional or established accounts overestimate human altruism. In these accounts, speakers are always honest, listeners are always gullible, they are always cooperative. And we think that this is to some extent, of course, true in that linguistic communication is inherently cooperative with regard to the linguistic code as such. Of course, we need some degree of cooperation to actually be able to talk to each other. Nevertheless, we think that communication is clearly also not always mutually altruistic, so interlocutors can engage in antagonistic communication as well. They can pursue selfish and conflicting purposes. The listener's interests may actually conflict with those of speakers. And in general, there's a certain risk involved for speakers if they honestly self-express themselves all the time. It makes you predictable. The listener can actually take advantage of that. So if you honestly self-express yourself, there's a certain risk. At the same time, if you dishonestly self-express yourself, well, then that's not really self-expression in the first place. Good. Now, what we propose to hopefully take care of some of these issues at least is an alternative account that's based in evolutionary pragmatics. Thanks. I'm going to have to speed up a bit. Our account is based in evolutionary pragmatics and more specifically in animal communication studies, in particular Krebs and Dawkins 84, who state that the evolution of ritualized signal structures is the product of coevolution between the roles of manipulator and mind reader. So signalers typically assume the manipulator role in which they attempt to alter the behavior of others, while recipients assume the mind reader role in which they attempt to anticipate the future behavior of others. To make this clearer, an example would be dogs baring their teeth. So originally, the baring of the teeth was probably just an automatic response, so the lips kind of start to draw back a bit before the dog actually starts biting someone. Now, if that dog met another dog, then the baring of the teeth could be interpreted as, oh my god, this dog is going to bite me, I should probably escape, I should probably flee, I don't want to get in a fight. So the recipient of that involuntary signal is mind reading or trying to mind read, anticipate the behavior of the dog in order to make them, well, in order to get the most out, or in order to be able to counteract it in some way. Now, the first dog who's baring his or her teeth, could then manipulate this, so could use this interpretation and say, think, okay, if I bare my teeth, then he will flee. I don't need to do anything, I just need to move my lips a bit and that does the trick. So there's a lot of, in any interaction, there's a lot of mind reading and using mind reading to manipulate, to anticipate behavior and so on and so forth. Now, what Krebs and Dawkins then argue is that because of all this, the interest of the recipient in the subjective intentional state of the interlocutor should be greater than the interest of the signaler to actually reveal their true intentions. So there's a greater risk for the signaler to reveal what he or she is actually on about, and there's a quite high benefit for the recipient in being able to anticipate what's going to happen. If we then assume that human communication is not at all that different from animal communication, or is still subject to the same selectional pressures, then we'd assume that this is also true for human communication, for human language use. So we'd argue, or the hypothesis that we want to put forward is that subjectifications in the end reflect pragmatically motivated inferences about attitudes, beliefs, and so on and so forth, of speakers, which are drawn by the listeners even when such inferences are actually not invited by the speakers. The subsequent semanticization or conventionalization of such more subjective readings then represents, in contrast, represents the response of the speakers as they come to anticipate the ways in which they are second-guessed. Good, just as an example, if we take villain again, so a statement or a more objective statement such as you are a villain that a speaker might propose and just report the fact that X is a villager, lives in a village, is from a village, could by the listener be interpreted as, well, this is obvious, he must mean more than that, probably he thinks badly of villagers and intends to insult X, so there must be something more about this proposition than just a mere objective fact. If the speaker then comes to anticipate that the listeners might interpret his or her statement in this more subjective way, then villain or the element can adopt the more subjective meaning by convention, in this case rascal. Good. What are the advantages of our proposal? Well, listeners here figure as independent agents with agendas of their own. One main advantage. The second is that we take this possibility of antagonistic communication into account, which we think is more realistic. There are still certain problems, especially with if we directly take over the Krebs and Dawkins account, namely that language evidently, even in the animal realm, also serves just basically the transaction of information, so it's not always only about mind reading and intentional states. And where the former accounts are a bit too optimistic, we think that this is maybe a bit too pessimistic. So communication is not necessarily antagonistic, of course. Humans are generally even more cooperative than most animals. We have a highly evolved theory of mind, and we use it mainly for cooperative purposes. So in our modified proposal then, we've got 4 options for speakers and listeners. They can, or for interlocutors, they can altruistically manipulate others, so share true information to alter the behavior of others to their advantage. In contrast, they can also use selfish manipulation, so impart false information to alter the behavior of others to their own advantage. Listeners or recipients can then either altruistically mind read, so anticipate the future behavior of others in order to be better able to support them, or selfishly mind read, so anticipating future behavior to be in a better position to counter their moves. More specifically, taken over for language then, this means that speakers and listeners can either cooperate or defect or non-cooperative. So we've got cooperative speakers who construct true messages with the purpose of informing listeners about the world and or their beliefs, or cooperative listeners who just take it at face value, interpret messages as true. On the other hand, we have we can have non-cooperative or defective speakers who deliberately construct false messages with the purpose of disinforming listeners, and not defective listeners who either disbelieve or remain agnostic about the truth of a statement, but nevertheless exploited as data from which to second-guess speaker intentionality. At the same time, interlocutors always have 2 additional options, namely, as I said in the very beginning, both speakers and listeners can intend or interpret signals as either objective or subjective, so either as about brute or social facts that are constructed as more objective, or as about subjective intentional states of the speaking subject. And the questions that we then want to test, or the questions that we want to address, is that assuming that humans always have these 2 options, which readings should they intend to convey as speakers, what should they go for as listeners, and what's the evolutionarily stable combination of these roles and interpretations. And that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest few minutes. So we did this, we addressed this by using evolutionary game theory. In evolution, well, game theory most basically is a branch of applied mathematics. The most important points are that that there's players who have different strategies at their disposal, and depending on which strategy they choose and their counterpart chooses, they get a certain payoff, so they're more or less successful. A very simple example would be rock, paper, scissors. So depending on what you choose and what the other person chooses, you either lose or win. Evolutionary game theory then looks at large populations of potential players, so it's not about one single game and the outcome of that game, but about enormous amount of games and the average success that one strategy or a strategy combination has. In our game, we've got two positions and two strategies. So players can either assume a speaker position or a listener position. They can choose between subjective and objective reading. And that amounts to 4 behavioral types. So you can be subjective when speaking and subjective when listening, or subjective only when speaking but objective when listening, and so on and so forth. Now, we then add another layer in which we include this whole cooperation defection thing. So players can be either cooperative or non-cooperative, and we set this ratio of cooperative players beforehand to test different hypotheses. So this is not a result of the game, but we just try out what happens if, for example, there's 50% cooperative players, 50% non-cooperative, or 30-70, and so on and so forth. And this then yields 4 interaction types which occur at different probabilities. Payoff assignment, then, so which strategy is successful or more successful then depends on whether it's cooperative and or defective players which meets, and on the particular strategies they choose. Speakers and listeners get different payoffs, so this is an asymmetric game. And most basically we assume that speakers gain by misinforming listeners, but they lose by sharing true information. And listeners gain by believing true information, but lose by believing false information. So the crucial assumptions that we make is that exclusive information is power. Information about intentional states is less valuable to listeners than to speakers. And also, very importantly, the payoffs are independent of and therefore unaffected by other costs or benefits that are incurred in any communicative exchange. So it's clear that communication or that actually saying something true to an interlocutor might gain you social credibility and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of other factors, of course, involved, but we assume that these are constant. And it's clear that this is a simplification used to test specific assumptions. So it's clear that communication as such is much more complex than what we model here. Finally, payoffs are numerical, but it's really only the ordering that matters. So we've used -1 to -3, or 1 to 3 here, but it could be any numbers as long as they are ordered in a certain way. I'll give you a quick example before I get to the result and to the end. Imagine an interaction type where the speaker lies and the listener believes, and the chosen strategies are both speakers and listeners are objective. Now in this case there's a large benefit for the speaker but high costs for the listener. Why? Well, speakers successfully manipulate listeners to their own advantage. They transmit false information about objective facts, but the listeners interpret information as true. I've tried to come up with a nice example for this, but it's a bit difficult. One thing I think might illustrate it at least somewhat appropriately is, imagine that there's cake somewhere at the department, and your colleague tells you well, the cake is in the tea kitchen on the second floor, but actually it's in an office on the ground floor. Now, if you then believe that this is true, that the cake is upstairs, and you walk up there and you find that there isn't actually any cake there, then you've lost quite a bit. You've lost time in actually walking up, you've lost energy, and you've gained nothing at all because there's no cake. The speaker, on the other hand, has gained quite a lot because he or she can eat all the cake on their own. Simple example, and of course, again, it's a lot more complex, but this is more or less where we're coming from. Good, and now, before I start, very quickly the results. So we then model this using replicator dynamics, and I'm not going to get into that. The results of it are that the qualitative long-term dynamics very crucially depend on the ratio of cooperative players. So if there are less than 70% of cooperative players in a population, then objective when speaking, subjective when listening is evolutionary stable strategy. If there's a lot of, or almost exclusively, cooperative players in contrast, then we get cyclic dynamics. So in scenario A, if there's a fair amount of non-cooperative players, more than approximately 30%, then this strategy of be objective when speaking but subjective when listening is optimal. So if there's a certain amount of non-cooperative behavior, it's better for listeners to scan utterances for clues about speaker intentionality than to take an utterance at face value. And we think this quite clearly corresponds to subjectification phenomena. So utterances are interpreted as more subjective than intended, meaning it's a more listener-driven mechanism. And we think that this is quite rare. This is the more realistic scenario because, well, we assume that there is always a certain amount of non-cooperation involved in communication, even if it's not straight out lying in more than 30% of the time. Just something like if someone asks you, how are you, and you say fine, but really you're really stressed out and horribly depressed, then that's a sort of lying or non-cooperation in the first place. So yeah, non-cooperation shouldn't be taken too strictly here. Good. Scenario B, which we find to be less likely, is if there are almost exclusively cooperative players, then listeners cyclically adapt their strategies to changes produced by the speakers. So populations with many or exclusively cooperative players will, we think, not promote subjectification because listeners can trust speakers, and it's advantageous for listeners to behave just like exactly like the speakers. So to come to my conclusions, what we've tried to do, or what I've tried to tell you here, is about a hypothesis of subjectification that's grounded in evolutionary pragmatics and animal communication studies. So what we suggest, or what we propose, and we think our results support this, is that subjectification, in its first phase at least, is really listener-driven, and only speaker-driven in the second phase, when it's about semanticizing or conventionalizing these pragmatic inferences. And we think that this account is at least as plausible as traditional accounts, and might even be explanatorily deeper than mere reference to speaker needs, more realistic than accounts which assume language change to reflect absolute cooperativeness, and also more parsimonious in that it's compatible with accounts of non-human communication systems, which we take as an advantage. On a methodological level, finally, we hope to have shown that game theory can help us in testing whether specific assumptions about the driving factors of change can actually predict its progression in the way we see or assume. And that's it. Thank you very much. Sorry for taking long.